Midnight this Monday is the hard deadline for submissions and comments to the state pricing regulator on North Sydney Council's proposed 53 to 63% rate hike. As The Sun has reported, the council has lodged a so-called special rate variation application with the State Independent Pricing and Regulatory Tribunal. Council wants a 53% overall rate rise over 3 years, jumping to 63% for so-called minimum ratepayers, i.e. those in apartments. The so-called Block of Seven, the real independents, Labor and Green councillors who tend to rubber stamp most things that come their way, voted for rate rises at a cantankerous special meeting back in January. Here is Mayor Zoe Baker justifying the proposal at the time.
As many have said, it was just under 12 months ago that we gathered here and resolved to apply to IPART for a special rate variation that was to align with Council's 10-year plan. The purpose of that application was to address Council's unsustainable financial position, to meet the challenges of operating deficits, severely underfunded infrastructure renewals, the escalating asset renewal backlog, low financial resilience due in part to the denuded internal reserves that are a result of the North Sydney Olympic Pool redevelopment project, and Council's capacity to invest in new community infrastructure to meet the needs of the existing and rapidly increasing population.
But now the actual council application has been published by IPART, residents and minority councillors are not impressed with what they see. They have raised serious concerns with the rate rise push.
I think it's like a well-nourished kid with a pocket full of money walking into a candy shop. What we've got is a council that is not in financial difficulty, doing a financial grab, doing a money grab, and not being altogether clear about what it wants to do with the money.
Looking at the audited financial statements, for example, over the last 7 years, they show a robust financial council. But then when you look at the projections in the long-term financial plan, there is a material shift in the operating performance, and it is forecasting a weaker council. Now, I find that very concerning, but when we look back at the history of councils' budgeting and then actual performance, there are material variances between the forecasts and the actual performance.
As mentioned, this is the second attempt by North Sydney Council to raise rates in less than a year. Last year, it saw an 87% rate rise, but IPART sent the council packing. Peter, a Milsons Point resident, wonders what is different this time.
I think the arguments are very poor. IPART were very clear about what needed to be done, and council have just simply sort of washed their last one with a few sort of superfluous or remarks and just resubmitted it. So they haven't really dealt with the conditions that IPART have said you want to look at. And incidentally, I think if there was a cohesive argument there about stuff, then people would be quite interested in looking to see how increased rates would improve, but it is just devoid of any facts. It's terrible.
One serving councillor who doesn't like what he sees is independent James Spenceley, who attracted the second highest vote in his ward at the last council election.
It's a request list for a rate increase with a trust me bro, we'll do some stuff later on, which is quite fundamentally broken logic, because if you get the rate rise, why do you need to sell assets? Why do you need to cut costs? You know, it's a circular argument. So, yeah, the application hasn't really changed fundamentally. It hasn't addressed IPART's issues at all. And it's fundamentally, I think, just the approach that they've taken again is fails to understand what the IPART process is.
Spenceley is particularly critical of the quality of the application, given it is a second attempt.
The reason I oppose it is they haven't done the work, and it's well, I don't want to say sloppy, but it's very basic work. I mean, there's no way in reality the only answer to the rate rise, to the funding problem and asset backlog is a rate rise. In any business, in any council, in any government department, you would use a multiple of things. You'd use some rate rise, you'd use some debt smoothing, you'd use some asset sales, you'd use some cost reductions, and that would form your solution. So to just put the burden onto the ratepayers doesn't pass my personal test, doesn't pass the ratepayers tests, clearly, and it certainly doesn't pass the IPART tests.
One specific concern is that the earlier consultation used to establish resident attitudes towards what should be council's spending priorities was flawed. Here's Joan, a local resident.
I'm concerned that phase 1 of the survey, which was conducted in August, was designed to identify valued services, and that has been used to claim ratepayer preference for higher rates. But if you look at the survey, in that survey, residents were asked if services should be reduced, maintained or increased without knowing the cost or financial impact on the 10-year strategic plan. Hence, any conclusions around willingness to pay using the results of the August 25 survey are not credible. Then in phase 2, which was conducted in November, and costs were finally disclosed, in that survey only 22% favoured option 3, i.e. the 53% rate rise. And this shows a clear lack of support for increased spending and lack of support for the rate increase when the community were provided with full cost disclosure.
The survey methodology is fundamentally flawed. It uses a multitude of leading questions to get the answer they want. So, on any metric, the way that they polled the community is pretty broken. But the fundamental thing is they're cherry-picking the answers. So if you ask the community, do they want more services? Yes, they've said yes, they want the same or more. But at the same time, they're not willing to pay for it. They don't want 80% voted against or didn't want the increased rates of option 3. So how can those two things coexist? You can't have people wanting more and increased services and also not being willing to pay for it. So it's fundamentally flawed in its methodology. It's designed to get an outcome. That's just not cynically, that's you can run that through any form of process on conducting surveys, independent surveys, and it fails. So the flat out problem with the SRB is they've started with the answer. They want a lot of rate rise to spend money on new projects to increase an asset backlog that was an accounting treatment, and then they've gone back and tried to fundamentally make the numbers and everything look like the community wants it and supports it, and they just don't.
Another issue raised by some is Council's blanket assertion that the North Sydney LGA has the capacity to pay the rate increases. Local resident Peter has an argument against this.
The figures being relied on are 2021 figures, and since that date there has been steep increases in mortgage interest rates, significant rises in median rents, sustained inflationary pressure, and really one of the crux of this is that the real wages are falling back to 2011 levels, which means that the environment in which this decision was made is completely different. The 52% of residents are renters, and they will bear the increased rate through the landlord increasing the rent because of the changes in the council rates. And I was just had a cup of coffee with a friend of mine this morning whose rent was put up $100 a week the moment her landlord found about the earlier SRB. And it's caused her quite a lot of grief because she's a 82-year-old living a single pensioner and has no other alternative income, and she can't leave this area. She lived here most of her life. So these sorts of generalisations have cruel results on a lot of people.
Liberal councillor Jessica Keane points out that the proposed rate rise was originally prompted by a council community consultation program named Informing Strategies. This attempted to elicit resident views on what assets and services should be developed and funded by council.
Last year, 78% of people rejected these strategies. So why is council still pursuing them and saying these reflect the community views? A temporary rate rise to fund specific capital works was never properly offered as an alternative, yet it would be far more appropriate than a permanent compounding increase. Council claims community strongly supports rate rises. That's simply misleading. When residents actually found out the size of the increase, only 1 in 5 supported it. Real alternatives to rate rises were not considered. For example, a review of the asset portfolio has not been done, and asset sales were not considered appropriate. Council describes North Sydney residents as having an exceptional capacity to pay, using figures from 21, a COVID year when interest rates and rents were historic lows.
For former Councillor Ian Mutton, it is simply a case of whether the increase is justified.
It fails to meet the broad category of, is the increase justified? And the simple answer is it's not. You've got a council that has on hand, cash on hand, term deposits, 100 million. You've got a council that has traded operating profit on average for the last 10 years of 16 million. What's needed here is for council to actually focus on the needs of the community and how to deliver those. And what we don't need is having a council with visions that are not supported by business cases, visions that are not supported by how they're going to be funded. This takes us into the realm of fairyland. And we need a council to be firmly anchored in the presence in our community where we have people who are struggling to cover their own costs. And now they're faced with a council that wants a rate increase of, depending where you are, 63% or 53%. It's outrageous. And I'm sure IPART will see it that way.
I think the residents of North Sydney deserve better and that we need to find other ways.
So what do you think? Do you agree with council that it has a financial crisis and needs more funding? Or do you agree with the critics? You can make your views known to IPART either through a comment or a written submission on their website by midnight on Monday.